My name is Alyssa. I am 29 years old and I live alone in a small one-bedroom apartment in Portland, Oregon. I have been renting this place for about 9 months now. It is not luxury by any means. Old hardwood floors that creak when you breathe too hard, a perpetually leaky kitchen faucet, and a heater that makes a clunking noise every time it kicks on, but it is close to my office and most importantly, it is pet-friendly. That was a non-negotiable because of my golden retriever, Milo. He is 6, thinks he is still a puppy, and has more personality than most people I meet. This apartment was supposed to be our little corner of peace. The property I live in is part of a duplex. The unit next to me is vacant more often than not, and the landlord, Tom, owns the entire building. When I first moved in, he came off as one of those overly chatty older guys, probably mid-50s, maybe early 60s if I had to guess. He wore fleece vests a lot, drove a pickup, and seemed to pride himself on being a hands-on landlord. I figured he was harmless. Sure, he asked too many personal questions when I signed the lease, like if I had a boyfriend or worked long hours, but I chalked that up to old-fashioned awkwardness. Maybe I wanted to believe he was just socially clumsy. I was wrong. At first, the visits were spaced out. Once every couple of weeks, he would knock and say he was checking the gutters or making sure the dryer vents were clear. Annoying, but manageable. Then it started escalating. 2 months ago, he began showing up completely unannounced. Sometimes he would knock once, not wait, and just let himself in with his key. The first time it happened, I was in the kitchen, and he startled me so badly I dropped a glass. He laughed it off and said something like, just checking the pipes, like that somehow made it okay. I told him he needed to give me proper notice before coming over. Oregon law requires 24 hours unless it is an emergency. He would smile, shake his head, and say, it's my property, I'm just doing my job. As if that erased the fact that it was my home, my space. I started locking the door with the deadbolt from the inside when I was home, but that didn't stop the anxiety of wondering when he might try again. The breaking point came one Saturday afternoon. I had just come out of the shower, towel wrapped around me, still drying my hair, and there he was, standing in the living room, holding a clipboard and pretending to inspect the walls. I screamed. Milo barked his head off. He looked unfazed and claimed he was checking for water damage because the unit next door had a plumbing issue. I told him to get out. I was shaking, angry, humiliated. He just shrugged and said something dismissive about how he knocked and no one answered. I knew then that this was not going to stop unless I made it stop. I was afraid to push too hard. I have heard horror stories about tenants being evicted for trying to assert their rights, but I also could not live like that anymore. I needed proof. I went online that night and ordered 2 small cameras. One looked like a regular phone charger. I put it in the living room. The other I installed above the front door, facing inside. They were both motion activated and recorded everything directly to the cloud. It took only 3 days. The first clip was him letting himself in around noon on a Tuesday. I was at work. He walked around the living room for a few seconds, then went straight to the bookshelf. He pulled down a decorative box I keep there that holds random stuff, batteries, receipts, a spare key to my car, and looked through it. Then he opened a drawer in my coffee table, rifled through some papers, and stared at a framed photo of me and Milo for a disturbingly long time. The second clip was worse. He came in again, this time around 9:45 a.m. He went into the bedroom. He opened my jewelry box and touched almost everything in it, even held one of my earrings up to the light like he was admiring it. Then he picked up a hoodie I had tossed over the couch, and this part made me physically ill. He brought it to his face and smelled it. After that, he sat on the edge of my bed for what felt like forever. Just sitting. Not moving. Looking down at the floor. Then, without doing anything else, he left. I watched the footage 3 times, crying harder each time. It was not just a boundary violation. It was intimate, invasive, predatory. And I had no idea how many other times he might have done something like this before I had cameras. I called the lawyer I had spoken to after the shower incident. She had told me to reach out if anything else happened. I sent her the footage. She responded within an hour saying I absolutely had a case and we started building it immediately. But I was still so angry. Furious. Not just at what he had done but at how smug he had always acted about it. Like the rules did not apply to him. Like my fear and discomfort were just side effects of him doing his job. So I did something else. I went on Facebook and searched for him. I did not expect to find much, but it turns out his profile was public. Buried in his friends list was a woman named Carol with the same last name. Her profile picture showed her standing in front of a Christmas tree with Tom, wearing matching flannel pajamas. That was all I needed. I crafted a short message, attached one of the video clips, and sat there for 10 minutes before hitting send. Then I did it. I told her, calmly and respectfully, that I was sorry to be the one to bring this to her attention, but I thought she deserved to know what her husband was doing when she was not around. And then I ended the message with the words I had rehearsed over and over again in my head. You deserve to know what your husband is doing when you're not around. Carol responded within hours. Her message was short but powerful. Thank you. This isn't the first time he's crossed a line. I'll be handling this. Just 12 words. But they carried so much weight that I read them over and over again, trying to absorb the full impact of what they meant. 2 days later, I saw a moving truck in front of their house. It was one of those overcast Portland mornings, and I was walking Milo down the street when I spotted the truck. There was Carol, methodically carrying boxes out to the curb with a quiet intensity. No shouting. No chaos. Just calm, precise movement. Tom wasn't anywhere in sight. A neighbor told me he'd left early that morning and hadn't returned. I guess she meant it when she said she'd be handling it. It gave me an unexpected rush of satisfaction. Not because I wanted to destroy someone's marriage, but because I realized in that moment that I wasn't crazy. That creeping sense of unease I had felt for months wasn't in my head. It had roots. It had evidence. And now it had consequences. On the legal side, my lawyer wasted no time. She drafted and sent a formal cease and desist letter the morning after I gave her the footage. She also filed a complaint with the city's tenant rights organization. We were not just going after him for harassment, we were documenting a pattern of illegal entry, tenant intimidation, and possible voyeurism. It turns out that was the crack in the dam. Because Tom had a history. Within days, my lawyer forwarded me records and anecdotal reports from the tenant rights organization. Tom had racked up complaints over the last 6 years. Most of them were verbal, undocumented, or dismissed as hearsay. Former tenants claimed he would let himself in without warning. A few mentioned strange behavior, items moved, clothes disturbed, furniture rearranged slightly. But no one had ever caught him in the act. Not until now. My footage changed that. My case gave everything a hard spine. Real timestamps. Real video. Real violation. Then came the part one wasn't prepared for. The day after the cease and desist letter was officially delivered, Tom showed up at my door. It was just after 6 p.m. I had just gotten home from work and was feeding Milo when I heard a sharp knock. The sound froze me. It wasn't the familiar light tap of the UPS guy or the lazy rhythm of a neighbor. It was forceful. Entitled. I checked the camera feed on my phone and there he was, standing on my porch, hunched and disheveled. His face was drawn like he hadn't slept. Eyes sunken, lips twitching. He looked less like the smug man who used to barge into my home and more like someone barely holding himself together. I didn't open the door. I used the microphone feature on my security system and told him he was being recorded and that law enforcement would be contacted immediately if he didn't leave. He stood there for a second, face twitching, then muttered something I couldn't quite hear and stormed off. He peeled out of the driveway like a teenager throwing a tantrum. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. 2 days later, I received a call from someone who introduced themselves as a city housing inspector. They were launching an investigation into Tom and his properties. Apparently, my footage had triggered more than just my own legal case, it opened the floodgates. What I didn't know until that call was that Tom owned several other duplexes and small rental units across the city. And once word started circulating among tenants that there was video evidence, proof, others started coming forward. People with stories eerily similar to mine. Some had never reported anything because they thought no one would believe them. Others said they did complain but were met with vague apologies or threats of eviction. A few described feeling watched. One even said she changed the locks only to have them mysteriously replaced again when she was out of town. It was like watching a curtain lift and seeing just how deep the rot had spread. The inspector told me they were prioritizing inspections of all his properties and that multiple tenants had agreed to make official statements. They were even pulling in legal aid attorneys to help low-income renters who felt intimidated or too afraid to speak up without support. The sense of vindication was intense. But so was the grief, because it wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't just about a creepy man violating my space. It was about how many people had been quietly enduring that same sense of powerlessness, that same pit in their stomach every time they came home, and how no one had listened until now. My footage wasn't just evidence. It was a crack in the silence, a starting point, and as I stood in my living room, watching Milo do lazy circles before curling up by the window, I realized something else. Justice isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it starts with a camera that looks like a charger. Sometimes it looks like a moving truck parked in front of a house that had once seemed invincible. Apparently, I wasn't the only tenant who had something to say. The city inspection took less than 2 weeks, but the results sent shockwaves through every tenant who'd ever lived in one of Tom's buildings. The housing inspector contacted me directly to let me know the preliminary findings. They had concrete evidence that Tom had illegally entered at least 4 other apartments, not counting mine. And those were just the ones where they could cross-reference timestamps with tenant testimonies or find physical signs of disturbance. God knows how many more went unnoticed or were brushed off as forgetfulness or paranoia. One tenant, a woman in her early 60s named Marianne, had lived in the downstairs unit of one of his duplexes for over 5 years. She had always suspected something was off. She said things would be out of place when she got home. Her mail would disappear and reappear in strange stacks, and one time her cat was locked in the closet when she had never opened it that morning. But she had never had proof. She had convinced herself it was her imagination, or that maybe she was just getting older and misplacing things. When she found out about my case, she broke down. She told the inspector she hadn't slept through the night in months. She had felt violated, watched, but had no one to back her up. She was practically in tears when she thanked me. Her voice cracked as she said it, and I remember feeling this mixture of heartbreak and fury. How many women had he made feel unsafe in their own homes? How long had this gone on unchecked? Turns out the answer was far longer than I realized. And while the legal process was beginning to gain momentum, things were unraveling just as fast for Tom on the personal front. Carol filed for divorce. That news came to me through the neighborhood Facebook group of all places. One post from a woman who lived a block away simply read, "Anyone else see the moving truck at the Johnsons? Looks like Carol finally kicked Tom to the curb." The comments spiraled from there. According to a few mutual neighbors, she had changed the locks and told him never to set foot on the property again. For weeks afterward, people reported seeing Tom's truck parked in random places around town. One woman posted that he had tried to crash on her couch. He said he was between places and offered to pay rent. She refused, said he gave her the creeps, and when he refused to leave, she called the cops. It was satisfying in the way watching dominoes fall can be satisfying, especially when you know they were lined up by someone who thought they'd never be knocked over. Meanwhile, my lawyer was incredible. She handled every piece of communication, every legal document, every phone call to the city and housing boards. She helped me terminate my lease early without any penalties, citing not only the repeated unlawful entries, but also the emotional distress I had suffered. The landlord's breach of privacy, the potential for danger, the stress of living in fear, all of it created the conditions for what she called a constructive eviction. I didn't owe another cent. I found a new place across town, nothing extravagant, just a quiet second-floor unit in a well-maintained building owned by a legitimate property management company. The difference in professionalism was immediate. The locks were upgraded, cameras covered every entrance, and I had a designated contact person who responded to emails in under 24 hours. I could finally exhale. Milo settled in quickly too. His barking had decreased, his sleep was deeper, and he no longer paced by the door when I left. We had both been carrying more anxiety than I realized. But just when I thought the aftermath was beginning to taper off, something new unfolded. Something that felt like poetic justice. Turns out, Carol didn't stop at filing for divorce. The footage I sent her? She forwarded it to Tom's business partners. Tom co-owned a small but fairly successful local contracting business. They did everything from kitchen remodels to new home construction. I had seen their logo on trucks around the neighborhood dozens of times. One of his former partners, now apparently ex-partner, reached out to my lawyer through her firm's website. He left a formal statement. In it, he said they had absolutely no idea Tom was that kind of person and that they were severing all business ties effective immediately. He said he was sickened by what he saw and would be happy to provide further testimony if needed. According to public records that my lawyer pulled, the business dissolved within 3 weeks of that footage being shared. It was like watching a life unravel thread by thread. The walls around Tom were caving in fast. Now, with the help of the city and the mounting number of tenant complaints, Tom is under investigation for trespassing, privacy invasion, and potentially burglary. Some of the footage showed him going through personal belongings, jewelry, private papers, clothing. All of it done without permission, without notice, and without any legal pretense. In at least one case, he had entered a unit while a teenage tenant was home alone, using the same excuse of just checking the vents. Her mother is now part of the case as well. My lawyer says we have a strong claim for emotional distress. The videos speak for themselves. They don't show a confused old man or someone doing routine maintenance. They show deliberate, methodical violations of privacy, acts that can only be described as invasive and disturbing. And the consistent behavior across multiple tenants proves it wasn't accidental or isolated. It was a pattern. One he likely would have continued if he hadn't finally been caught. For the first time in a long while, I feel safe. Not just in my new apartment, but in my own skin. I stood up for myself. I didn't let him silence me or make me doubt what I knew to be true. And I gave other people the push they needed to speak out too. Now the law is catching up with him. And the foundation of lies he built his life on? It is collapsing under the weight of everything he thought he could get away with, especially considering how clearly predatory his behavior was. We went to court. It was surreal walking through the courthouse doors, knowing I was about to come face to face with the man who had infiltrated the most private corners of my life and pretended it was just routine maintenance. I had imagined this moment countless times, wondered if I'd fall apart, if I'd feel small under the weight of what he had done. The truth is, I didn't. Not because it wasn't terrifying, but because fear had stopped being unfamiliar. I had lived in fear. I had showered with doors locked and my phone on the counter, just in case. I had whispered into camera microphones from the safety of my own hallway. The fear didn't own me anymore. It had forged something else, resolve. Still, I didn't sleep the night before. I laid awake, listening to Milo breathing at the foot of the bed, memorizing the sound as if it might keep me grounded in the chaos of what was to come. But when the bailiff called my name and I stood, I felt strangely steady. Every step toward that witness stand was a step away from who I had been when this started, unsure, anxious, wondering if anyone would believe me. Now I had evidence. I had the law. I had myself. Tom sat at the defendant's table looking gaunt and deflated. His usual puffed-up arrogance was gone. He didn't make eye contact with me. Not once. He sat with his jaw clenched, his eyes locked on some invisible spot on the table in front of him. There were no outbursts, no attempts to charm or manipulate the room. The man who used to let himself into apartments like a king inspecting his castle now looked like he'd barely slept in a month. And frankly, I hoped that was true. His lawyer was the kind who wore expensive shoes and used phrases like deeply regrettable misunderstanding as if the footage of Tom sitting on the edge of my bed after sniffing my clothing was just some awkward handyman mishap. They didn't contest that it was Tom. The evidence was airtight. Instead, they tried to paint him as someone under stress, someone who had made a series of poor decisions without malicious intent. He had dedicated years to the community, they said. Helped maintain housing availability. There were references to his clean criminal record, his longtime business reputation, his respectable ties. But the judge didn't flinch. He watched the footage in full. He heard my voice on the recordings, first calm, then alarmed. He watched Tom dig through drawers, pick up my clothes, open my bedroom door. He listened to Milo's tags jingle faintly in the background, the only other sound in that still courtroom. There was no ambiguity in what we all saw. When the verdict was handed down, the weight of it landed in waves. The judge ruled in my favor on every count. Tom was ordered to pay a significant settlement for emotional distress. He was to cover all my legal fees in full. But more than that, under a newly enforced tenant protection statute, he was barred from owning or managing rental properties for at least 5 years. This was more than financial. It was a dismantling of his power, his leverage, his ability to control and manipulate renters under the guise of being their landlord. When that final part of the judgment was read aloud, I watched Tom deflate like air leaking from a balloon. He hunched forward, no longer even pretending to hold himself upright. It wasn't just that he had lost, it was that the system he had quietly abused for years had finally turned on him. But then something happened that caught everyone off guard. Carol stood up. She had entered the room quietly, sitting near the back, unnoticed by most. But when the judge asked if there were any final witness statements, she stood with slow purpose and walked forward. You could hear the shift in the room. Chairs creaked. People leaned in. Even Tom's lawyer looked rattled. No one had expected her. Her voice was calm, but you could hear years of tension layered into every word. She described nights when Tom came home at strange hours, offered vague excuses about tenants who needed checking in on. She talked about the folder she found in the garage full of stills from security footage and photos of a young woman's bedroom that he had claimed were evidence from a break-in. She had believed him because believing the alternative meant tearing her life apart. Then came the part that changed everything. She testified about finding photos on her own laptop, images she never took of a tenant's bedroom. The same angle, the same disturbing intimacy as the footage I had submitted. At the time, she told herself it was a cloud sync issue, some glitch. She deleted them and tried to move on because what else could she do? She had lived in fear, in denial, in silence. But this time, seeing someone else have the courage to speak, to fight, lit something inside her. She didn't just confirm my story, she exposed that this wasn't new. That Tom had a history, one stretching far beyond my unit and my footage. That there had likely been other women, other apartments, other moments stolen in the same calculated way. When she was done, she stood there for a moment longer, meeting the judge's eyes. Then she walked back to her seat. She didn't look at Tom once. The judge didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. Everyone understood. Her silence had finally become too loud to live with. After the proceedings ended, the room slowly emptied. My lawyer stayed behind, gathering paperwork, and told me that this case would likely become a precedent for tenant rights in the city. She said I had done something people rarely manage. I held someone like Tom accountable. Not just privately. Publicly. Legally. And just before I walked out the door, Carol approached me. She didn't hesitate. She wrapped her arms around me and pulled me into a tight, trembling hug. It wasn't performative. It wasn't for sympathy. It was relief. It was release. She whispered to me that she had lived with guilt for years, always suspecting, always wondering, never knowing how to stop it. And then she thanked me. She said I had saved her from a lifetime of doubt and fear. We left the courthouse separately. Two women scarred by the same man, both finally stepping into something that resembled peace. Tom is now facing additional charges. Trespassing. Invasion of privacy. Potential burglary. The investigation remains active and more witnesses have stepped forward since the case ended. Documents. Testimonies. It keeps building. The image of Tom as a respected landlord and businessman is crumbling under the weight of the truth. As for me, I sleep soundly now. I know that my front door means something. That lock doesn't mean trapped, it means secure. Milo stretches out by the window again, not guarding, just relaxing. And I feel like myself again, not broken, not silenced, but rebuilt. Justice was served.